Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Thank you for listening, whether it's at America One Radio or Progressive Voices via TuneIn or by podcast. I thank you for doing so. It is January 20th, 2025, a day that a lot of us not exactly looking forward to, although there's so much going on. Here I live in the city of Atlanta. We have teens temperatures today. Yeah, that's what we woke to. There was the threat of more wintry weather, and I would say that the cold says it's definitely wintry, but fortunately, it looks like we're going to avoid the precipitation element of that. We do have the college football playoff national championship tonight from Atlanta, Georgia, which means our city has been descended upon by fans of both Ohio State University and Notre Dame. It is also the Martin Luther King holiday, which means activities, some that have been canceled due to the extreme cold, some that are still happening throughout the cradle of the civil rights movement, which again is Atlanta, Georgia. This, of course, the home of Martin Luther King Jr., also the home church of Martin Luther King Jr. So lots to dive into today. First things first, we had a horrific tragedy late last week. For the story, we go to WAGA-TV Fox 5 Atlanta.
New at 11, activists and people in Atlanta's homeless community gathered at the site where a man experiencing homelessness was killed in an incident with city public works trucks. Now activists say the city needs to be held accountable for the untimely death. Fox 5's Eric Mock joins us now from Ebenezer Baptist Church with this story.
The site of this homeless encampment where this man was killed, just a few hundred feet away from this historic church where Martin Luther King Jr. preached. And activists claim that the civil rights leader would have been ashamed to see this happen here.
We all want to make sure that this horrific event never happens again in the city.
At a vigil Friday night, activists and friends of the man killed at this former homeless encampment lit candles to honor his memory.
It's very important that Cornelius Taylor is not forgotten, is not pretended like he didn't exist, which is, I think, what happened here.
That's Monica Johnson from the Housing Justice League, by the way.
According to the Atlanta Police Department, officers responded to Old Wheat Street Thursday at around noon. Officials say a man was injured while public works crews cleared the homeless encampment there. He later died at the hospital. They will not reveal exactly what happened. The witnesses here and homeless outreach groups like Hosea Helps tell Fox 5 a garbage truck ran over the man as he slept in his tent.
The people that gave the green light need to be held accountable. They need to lose their jobs. The process needs to be examined. And we need to understand that this can never happen. There is no excuse.
At the voice of Elizabeth Omalami with Hosea Helps.
We've reached out to the Public Works Department and APD to ask whether crews checked the tents before driving the truck in. Both told us they participated in outreach to the camps long before the sweep. Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens told us in a statement, quote, "We will review each of our processes and procedures and take every precaution to ensure this never happens again." In the meantime, Atlanta City Council member Liliana Bakhtiari, who attended the vigil, is calling for a stop to all homeless encampment sweeps.
Somebody was run over and killed, and not even immediately. I don't see how we move forward continuing to do this until we have an understanding of what went wrong here.
Now, we are still awaiting confirmation of the man's identity from the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office. Councilmember Bakhtiari says she's going to be calling for changes to how the city deals with homeless encampments at the upcoming city council meeting next week, and activists are calling on people to show up to that meeting. Reporting in Atlanta, Eric Mock, Fox 5 News.
We now actually do know the identity of the victim. He is Cornelius Taylor, and here to tell us a little bit about him from the organization Remerge is Sylvia Broom. Sylvia, thanks for joining me. First of all, tell me a little bit about your organization and what you guys do to help Atlanta's unhoused community.
Well, Remerge does a lot of things, but our whole goal is to create a community where the marginalized and the people with power, authority, live in the neighborhood, work in the neighborhood, everybody that has a stake in the neighborhood. We work to bring people together in conversation and relationship. So we're a community building organization, but since people often think that means architects and builders, I wanted to be quite clear that we are architects to a better society or a more vibrant, flourishing society.
Tell me how you came to know Cornelius Taylor.
Well, my role is to, I guess I would call it more or less a street pastor. My title is, what is it? Changes a lot. It is program lead for outreach, and in our context, it is the Sweet Auburn area.
Mm. So I'm trying to understand. Atlanta, by the way, has a rich history, for those who don't know, of pushing people aside to make way for big events. And we've had Super Bowls, numerous Super Bowls. We've had numerous big bowl games, college football championship games now coming here often. The Olympics, where we literally saw the evisceration, the elimination of public housing in Georgia's largest city and one of the largest cities in the country. So to hear of homeless encampments being swept away or tucked away or hidden away or folks, pushed to the side is no surprise. But give me an idea of how this usually plays out when the city decides it's time for a homeless encampment to go away. What normally happens and what went wrong in this case, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, let me say that all of the organizations, the outreach, the faith-based organizations, everybody that is got the heart and got the heart to help the marginalized community are underfunded, and so there's not a lot of people available to. I'm a pastor, so I may sometimes go into some. I guess more religious language, but I would say minister to the homeless folks, the marginalized folks. And so they're understaffed. And I've never met anybody that works in this field that does not have a heart for the people who are suffering.
Sure.
I met Cornelius late 2018, 2019 for sure. And I've known him since. And I have always found him to be extremely polite, kind, nice, just the kind of person that you enjoy being around.
Mm-hmm. Folks who are listening may find that striking because for most of society, the idea of being around someone who's homeless or being approached by someone who's homeless, a panhandler or something along those lines, and I know we're blurring the lines there because not all homeless people are panhandlers or vice versa, but to hear that is somewhat striking. So explain to me what it's like to work in your field and to interact with the unhoused or the homeless and come to that point where you do find it pleasant to be with someone, to try and look past the exterior to understand what's inside a person.
Well, the most important thing is that you have to get to know people. And within that, I think that the people that feel that all homeless people are possibly scary, maybe dirty, they can be very physically dirty, but their minds are not necessarily dirty. So the first thing you have to do is actually get to know somebody. I've been doing this work now since 2011, and I have found beautiful people. And one of the things that we always say that they need us as much as we need them, and we may need them even more than they need us. And to that point, I would say that if you don't know somebody, you don't know what they need. They know better what they need. So as we develop relationships, things become more and more honest, and you can observe needs, you can talk about needs and people's situations and how they got there. And but you can never do that if you don't have that relationship, if you don't know them.
We're with Sylvia Broom, the outreach coordinator with Remerge. She knew Cornelius Taylor. We'll get to know a little bit more about him and the plight of the homeless in Atlanta when the Ron Show returns on America One Radio and Progressive Voices via TuneIn. In our show notes today at ronshowatl.com, I'll include the link to the organization Remerge should you care to give to help them with their outreach ministry in the Auburn community of Atlanta. We're with Sylvia Broom from that organization, Remerge, talking a little bit about Cornelius Taylor. He is the homeless man who lost his life tragically in an encampment sweep done by the city of Atlanta last week. What is Cornelius' story? Is he from Atlanta? How did he become homeless? Talk a little bit about his struggles if you can.
Well, that's the thing is I don't have Cornelius's permission, obviously, to talk about him and his history, nor do I have his family's permission.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Fair enough. So I want to go back to the part where, we talk a little bit about how folks put together these encampments and then, cities, sometimes Georgia State Patrol or whatever, will decide it's time for the encampments to go away. How does this normally work, and what went wrong in this case, in your opinion?
Well, normally what would happen is, people want to live in community. That's the way that we're designed to live with other people. So people have to be somewhere. And so they'll gravitate towards people who are similar in situations that are like-minded. And that goes across the whole socioeconomic system where people move into neighborhoods because they find like-minded people they can be friends with.
True.
So this is how encampments start. And people live with each other. And just like people with means, sometimes you get along, sometimes you don't, sometimes you get frustrated. So the thinking, though, is that these are consistently violent. That's not what I've found since 2011. I really have never had a problem with anybody. And the very, very few times I have enough friends that they'll stand up with me. And that's the kind of experiences that I've had, is that once you know somebody, you become friends. And once you become friends, what wouldn't you do to help your friend? And that goes both ways. I think that a lot of people think that we'll help the homeless, but they don't really understand the mutuality of being effective.
Right.
As far as where do homeless encampments start, or how do they start, that's individual to the encampments. But again, people gravitate to like-minded people and people that they can relate to, be friends with, understand each other. So encampments can start anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear from folks who don't live in major cities who point to the fact that the homeless population is so much larger in larger cities. And as you point to, folks are gravitating towards like-mindedness and empathy. And I think that there seems to be more opportunity for receiving empathy in larger cities. And I don't even, dive into that as a political or socioeconomic or ideological. It just seems to be the case. It's, again, a numbers game, as I think you pointed out before. But when these encampments are going to be deconstructed, or I like to say erased, because it just seems like they like to be pushed to the side. Cities, states, again, when a major event's coming up, they like to push them to the side or hide them so that they can't be seen. What is, in your experience, this process like? I mean, you hear stories on the news. We've heard all this weekend how preventative measures were taken, and how this didn't happen is befuddling people. But what normally happens? I mean, do people literally from the city go into these encampments and remind them, listen, this is not your property. We have to clear this out. There are going to be crews here in a number of hours or days or whatever. And then is there follow-up? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, first of all, generally speaking, the outreach organizations will get notification that the encampment is slated to be, you said deconstructed, it's the word that most people use is cleared.
Right.
This encampment will be cleared.
Mm.
And ministry workers and outreach workers, having heard that, will go down and tell people, have a plan. Have a plan, because this is going to happen. We don't know a date exactly or a time, but have a plan. I imagine city workers do also communicate that, but I don't know that for sure. I've not seen a city worker down there, but that doesn't mean they're not there.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest problem is that people say this and then it doesn't happen. And this is just one of those things. I can't say why, but it doesn't happen. So people get fairly complacent until the last minute when the people show up in order to clear the encampment.
Right.
This causes a lot of problems because people don't have a lot of time to get their things together and move on. So it's one of those things where it's like your little child. If you say, I'm going to do this, if you do it again, but you never, ever follow through,
right.
People really are off balance and don't know what's going to happen for sure.
We're with Sylvia Broom, who is with the organization Remerge. I was noticing in a piece that WABE, our local NPR station here, you did speak to them. And when I was asking you about Cornelius and his story, I just kind of wanted to know a little bit about what you were willing to share with him. And I noticed that in that you talked about how he liked to draw. What sort of artist was Cornelius?
He really, he drew very well. I never got to see a huge amount of his work, but I will share a tender story that years ago, pre-COVID, I decided that we should have a Thanksgiving dinner for the people that are on the street in our office. And so quite a few people came. And at that point, I didn't really know him. I knew his wife at that point. I say wife, I don't know if they're actually married, but they live together as husband and wife. Anyway, and he came and I asked him, not knowing about his artistic talent, could you make a Thanksgiving sign for our office? We were busy decorating it with things that we made. Mm-hmm. And he just made the most beautiful Thanksgiving sign that we were all able to sign or put on there, things that we were thankful for. And we kept it up for a good long time, because even if a person is living on the margins, I have found more and more through the years that their thankfulness actually dives deeper than people that I have known that live in more affluent areas.
Incredible. You say he has or had a wife? Is he survived by this wife?
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah.
And have you spoken to her since this tragedy?
She was out of town when this happened, and I'm praising the Lord for that, because she would have been in the tent with him most likely, and we would be grieving and mourning her. His wife is a very, very good longtime friend, and I had seen her the day I saw her on Tuesday and spent several hours with her talking about things like changes, and she was on her way out of town, so we rode together around town so we could have some more intimate conversation about plans. The next day, he came over to my office, and we spent about a half hour talking about his plans. And he had a line on a job. He was tired of living the way he was living. And so that was about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock Wednesday, and he didn't even live 24 hours after that conversation.
A tragedy. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much for sharing what you could and were able to about Cornelius and his wife. What a story. What just a tragic story. And I also want to thank you for the work that you and your organization Remerge do in the Auburn community and throughout Metro Atlanta, helping with the homeless population. Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate you doing so. I'm going to make sure that we include your link to the organization in our show notes at ronshowatl.com so that folks who would like to pitch in or help out or know how to volunteer or make donations can do so.
I would very much like the opportunity for anybody and everybody to come down and see what I see and experience what I experience, because it's not what most people think.
For sure. Sylvia Broom with Remerge, thank you so much for joining the Ron Show today.
You have a wonderful day.
You do the same. Thank you. So I live just blocks from this, and I can tell you, anytime I get in the vehicle, no matter which direction I go, I'm going to drive by a homeless encampment. You see them along the interstates and the interchanges along the interstates. Bitter cold temperature, whether it's January, whether it's July when it's stifling hot, they're everywhere. And you hear Sylvia tell the story of Cornelius, who apparently had a wife, common law or otherwise, who had plans and were making changes to their life, jobs lined up, and tragically, Cornelius lost his life because the city needed to see itself look a little more spruced up for the out-of-town guests coming for a football game that'll take place tonight. Maybe if we want to make America great again, we could start by working on that. The Ron Show back after this. America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn.
This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Power for poor people will really mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, and the aggressiveness to make the power structure of this nation say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. And it is my hope that we will get together and be together and really stand up to gain power for poor people, black people, Mexican Americans, American Indians, Puerto Ricans, Appalachian whites, all working together to solve the problem of poverty.
That, of course, the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And some 60 years after that vision, America has failed to come close to achieving that sort of cohesiveness, the power of the many versus the power of the well-heeled few. This confluence, if you ask me, is not coincidental, obviously, but somewhat ironic. And I speak the confluence, of course, of the Martin Luther King holiday, the inauguration of a second Donald Trump presidency, and the recent passing of the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. I saw a letter to the editor that I shared on my Facebook page. That's Ron Show ATL on Facebook, Twitter, X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. I'm covering it all, I think I am. This letter to the editor, I thought, really summed up what's sort of been marinating in my mind for the past few weeks, and I've sort of touched on it a little bit, but I really think the crafter of this letter, Alan Smart, from the Salt Lake Tribune, just summed it up nicely. The headline, "The Death of Jimmy Carter and the Resurgence of Donald Trump spur the question, have we as a country changed so much in just 50 years? I've also had this open tab, I talk about open tabs all the time, that I haven't gotten around to reading or sharing, and I pretty much decided I wasn't going to, but I think it's important actually to now. On the heels of the tragedy in Atlanta over the weekend, an encampment cleared with a human being losing his life. Anyway, Ron Lieber wrote this piece in the New York Times that spoke to Jimmy Carter and materialism, how he was right about materialism, Jimmy Carter was, but wrong about us and our being unable to shake materialism as a society. First, the letter from the Salt Lake Tribune. Recently, Alan Smart writes, "We bid farewell to and celebrated the life and service of Jimmy Carter, our 39th president. He was a true statesman, humanitarian, and advocate for justice. But most importantly, he was a decent human being. On January 20th, that is today's date, an indecent man will become our president. He is a liar. I have done nothing wrong," he quotes. "Draft dodger, bone spurs, indeed. Tax evader, election cheater. I just want to find 11,780 votes," Alan quotes. "Bully, convicted criminal, serial sex abuser, thief, classified documents, and adulterer. The contrast between Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump is stark. The two men could not have been more different. In August of 1974, then-President Richard Nixon, amid the Watergate scandal, was facing certain impeachment, and at the urging of Republican congressional leaders, Nixon, while claiming he was not a crook, resigned. Oh, for the days when Republican leaders in Congress had spines, Alan Smart opines. Jimmy Carter, Alan Smart writes, was just what our country needed. In 1976, after the brief administration of Nixon's Vice President Gerald Ford, Carter was elected president on the strength of his vow to bring morality back to government and a promise never to lie to the American people. It is probably pure, by the way, I believe Jimmy Carter not lying to the American people was likely his political downfall. Alan's letter continues. It is probably pure coincidence that the intersection of a death and an inauguration has focused our attention on Carter and Trump. Carter was a peanut farmer who ascended to the presidency on a reputation of honesty. Trump was born into privilege and rose to the presidency despite a reputation of dishonesty and corruption. Have we as a country changed so much in just 50 years? Have we become stupider? Have we lost the ability to accurately assess another's character? Have we become so suggestible that we accept the rantings of a snake oil salesman as truth? Trump convinced nearly half of our nation's voters that he will redress their complaints and improve their lives. Fat chance, Alan Smart writes. He is mostly interested in lining his own pockets and those of his family members as well as those of his billionaire buddies. Incidentally, surely you know that Donald Trump is now a crypto billionaire. That anyone throughout the world, other global leaders, could purchase such coin to enrich the soon-to-be president of the United States. And for what? And to receive what in return, you ask? Well, at least you should. Anyway, Alan Smart concludes his letter. Jimmy Carter's death has shined a spotlight on the fact that our nation, in less than 5 decades, has evolved, I'd say devolved, from electing perhaps its most ethical president to electing its most unethical president. Twice, Alan. A discomforting trajectory. Equally discomforting is the fact that Trump, like his pals Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un, wants to be president for life, as he only half-jokingly frequently suggests. Buckle up. Our form of government is at risk. That is Alan Smart, who lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. A nice letter to the editor that I thought worthy of sharing. Also, speaking towards Jimmy Carter, Ron Liebert wrote this piece in the New York Times after he passed that spoke to Jimmy Carter finger-wagging, and he did back in the day, about our materialism when we were in another inflationary crisis, sort of, insisting that the American people, tighten their belts and ride through it together as a people. That's something I opined in the throes of the Joe Biden inflationary period that he could do as well. He didn't. And yet Joe Biden still leaves office today as a one-term president on the heels of what was 4 years of economic success, actually. The American people just felt it at the grocery store, obviously. Fuel prices, energy prices, and seemingly unaware, I would say half the electorate, that this was a global phenomenon that no one person, no one country could intervene on behalf of its people to circumvent, but an issue that was much worse outside the country. And we, the privileged nation that we are, we don't want to hear that anyway. Ron Lieber writes, halfway into his presidency, Jimmy Carter's back was against the wall. It was July 1979, the height of the energy crisis, and the beleaguered president went on national television to deliver not a speech, but a kind of sermon. The address, called The Crisis of Confidence. Feel free to look that up. That's a nice YouTube watch. Challenged Americans to acknowledge personal failings that he believed were compounding very real public problems. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption, said Mr. Carter. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. Interesting to just come upon this piece again, by the way, on the throes of we have TikTok, we don't have TikTok, we have TikTok again. And I'll dive into that in a little bit. But Let me read that quote again. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. Ron Lieber writes, the dangers of a society's growing ever more covetous of bigger and better and more seemed obvious enough to Mr. Carter, who grew up in rural Georgia and lived in public housing as a young adult. By appealing to our better angels, he believed he could inspire in all of us a sense of thrift that would help heal America's ills. Environmental degradation, dependence on foreign energy, sound familiar? The power of special interests, sound familiar? And political extremism, sound familiar? For a fleeting moment, Americans listened. Mr. Carter's approval ratings jumped 11 points within hours. But partisans smeared the address. They almost immediately called it the malaise speech, and pilloried Mr. Carter, saying he was blaming Americans for problems that they hadn't created and that presidents were supposed to solve. And see, this is where I say to we the people, yes, sorry, problems we created. A lot of the problems we deal with today are problems of our own creation, and Americans don't want to hear that. And Donald Trump, and not just Donald Trump, but most politicians don't want to tell you that, because the lesson that Jimmy Carter taught future politicians was, don't ask the American people to make sacrifices or point out that they are making sacrifices. And by goodness, don't tell them that they might be the cause of issues that they're suffering from. Global wildfires coming home to roost, powerful storms making their way into Appalachia. Don't tell the American public it's our first world lifestyle that's causing the sort of climate change issues that we are starting to feel the heavy burden of ourselves. That also chases millions of people from their home countries to safe harbor here. We don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear that our military actions do the very same thing. They send people here to safe harbor. If they don't talk like us, look like us, worship like us, they are unwelcome. And they are the problem. Back to Ron Lieber's piece. Everything that happened after the speech, from persistent inflation to the Iranian hostage crisis, wiped away any warm feelings the voters had. He lost his re-election bid in a landslide to Ronald Reagan. 16 months later, at the dawn of a decade that glamorized materialism like few, if any, had ever come before it. The decades that followed have shown that Mr. Carter had the diagnosis right. Materialism has become epidemic, endemic even. We mostly fail to ask ourselves one searching, overarching question. How much is enough? Mr. Carter misread the nation in thinking that we would look within and without and then answer. In fact, Ron Lieber writes, there is little about our patterns since his address to suggest that we wish to earn, own, and consume less, or that we have awakened to the fact that having, buying, and using more may fail to make us happier. I would also add, or even make us realize, comes at the expense of others somewhere else on this planet. Consider how our children feel, Ron Lieber writes, after we're mostly done raising and educating them. The Cooperative Institute Research Program at the University of California, Los Angeles surveys first-year college students every year. The percentage who named being very well off financially as an important goal doubled from 1967 to 2019. Those who wanted to develop a meaningful philosophy of life decreased by nearly half. Research by Tim Kasser and Jean Twang showed that materialism among 12th graders increased over time, peaking in the late 1980s and early 1990s with Generation X, and then stayed at those historically high levels among millennials. There was a trend underway at the time Carter was making this speech, and it basically just amplifies in the next 10 years rather than being suppressed, said Mr. Kasser, an emeritus professor of psychology at Knox College and the author of The High Price of Materialism. The lingering belief that Mr. Carter's presidency was a failed one cast its own cloud over the crisis of confidence speech. But whatever ailed the American psyche was mostly not his fault. A nation's character, like its economy, is never the province of a single leader. Nevertheless, even Donald Trump, by the way, nevertheless, Mr. Carter's words were easy political pickings. Mr. Reagan used Mr. Carter's call for moderation as a kind of anvil to define the sitting president. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Mr. Reagan asked. Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? As Jonathan Alter wrote in his very best, his excellent biography of Mr. Carter, the politics of candor were terrible. Mr. Carter's wise counsel made him an easy mark for anyone inclined to criticize him as a finger-wagging scold. If you have concerns about consumption in society, it's very difficult not to sound moralizing and patronizing. That is Alison Holm, Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Change at the University of Northampton in England and the author of A Brief History of Thrift. And so we got the opposite of what Mr. Carter wished for. Yuppies arrived in the 1980s, and the 1990s brought us Hummers to guzzle the gas that people had waited in line for 15 years earlier. In 2001, President George W. Bush wanted us to get back to our daily routines and fly to Disney World after the September 11 attacks. And the Obama administration couldn't bear to slice away at a whopping tax break that makes it much easier for affluent families to spend $400,000 per child in college. Since then, the rise of social media has been marked, among other dreadful things, by lifestyle, braggadocio, and algorithms fine-tuned to serve scarily relevant ads. And then, a man who named a gold-tinged tower after himself became our president. Ron Lieber continues, rarely has there been an acute need for collective financial sacrifice during these last few decades, or much of any other kind of national sacrifice for that matter. When the test has arrived, we haven't exactly passed with flying colors. A considerable minority of Americans resented staying home and wearing masks during the early uncertain stages of the coronavirus pandemic amid ongoing protestations of a so-called loss of freedom. The tying together of rights with consumption is absolutely rife, said Dr. Hulme, whose academic research focuses on both of those topics. This drives me insane, she added. Mr. Kasser watched these developments with a sense of foreboding because his research has shown that higher levels of materialism are associated with societal instability. The pandemic only turned up the heat on a roiling cauldron of social problems. Growing economic inequality, horrific episodes of racism, worsening political divides, and a deep mistrust in the legitimacy of our elections. And it's not like advertising led up, he said. Ron Lieber writes, we will be tested again. Next time it may be a climate-related catastrophe. Driven in part by the very patterns of consumption that Mr. Carter warned against in his speech. He called for turning down the thermostat in the winter and for 20% of the nation's energy to come from solar power by 2000. All these years later, we've done neither. Interesting, the confluence, right? The re-anointing of Donald Trump as the 46th president of the United States on this day, the Martin Luther King holiday, and weeks after the passing of Jimmy Carter. There's a lot that we can learn about ourselves. And Ron Lieber, in this piece in the New York Times, tries to help us see that, to pull that mirror before our eyes. There's more to that piece. Take a quick break. Back after this. Final few minutes of today's Ron Show on January 20th, 2025, the Martin Luther King holiday, also the inauguration day for the 46th President of the United States, Donald John Trump.
And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites. So that love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. Now we got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best. Power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love.
Again, the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Just this line he said just then, to me, summarizes our binary political ideology.
Power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
So this show where I led, speaking of the death of a homeless person who was run over essentially by a bulldozer preparing for the clearing of a homeless encampment as we await the national championship college football game here in Atlanta. Got to make the city look pretty for the out-of-towners. On the day that Donald Trump gets sworn in again as the 46th president of the United States, and just weeks after Jimmy Carter's passing, it's just one of those look-in-the-mirror moments that the American public is probably too busy focusing on, do we or do we not have TikTok in order to have that introspection. Back to the Ron Lieber piece that I was reading about. Jimmy Carter speaking of materialism and the crisis of confidence speech, and how Jimmy Carter was right about materialism and wrong about the American public being able to draw it down a little bit. Let's see, where did I leave off? Oh, this quote. I think in Carter's mind there was some hope. That's Kevin Madsen, professor of history at Ohio University, author of the book about Mr. Carter's speech. What the heck are you up to, Mr. President? But I think there is profound doubt that we can muster the strength to do something about a problem that could destroy the planet. It seems unlikely that politicians today would give a speech anything like Mr. Carter's address. That's my point. That would violate the vague but powerful principle that American exceptionalism should not be questioned. That is my point. That the answer to every national problem of any import is blunt force innovation. But it really isn't always the answer, and Mr. Carter knew it. After voters determined that he was not the kind of president they wanted, he demonstrated a mostly humble form of public service. As he maintained an international diplomatic profile, he led Bible study sessions and built houses with Habitat for Humanity. Maybe seeing the kind of work that he did after his presidency is another sign of hope, Madsen said, that someone can make an impact by being a citizen activist rather than by being president. We as individuals, Lieber writes, cannot block the sun or bridge the racial wealth gap, but we can do something. 5 or 10 or 20% more than we have done before. Individually, it won't move the needle much, but change can be catching. Earlier in the piece, Lieber introduced us to Alison Holm, Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Change at the University of Northampton in England, author of the book, A Brief History of Truth. And coming back to Dr. Holm, I think of the knock-on effects it can have. It's more about a kind of culture change, she says, that can potentially lead to larger groups of people questioning their own lifestyle. One way to begin, Lieber writes, is with a redefinition of thrift, a word that comes from similar root words as thrive. What if we cast it as the author Ramit Sethi does, as a relentless focus on spending well on a few things that make us happiest and then radically paring back on the things that matter less? I want people to change the way they live because it might be nicer for them, Dr. Holmes said. Eventually, we're going to have to try, and the longer we wait, the harder it will be. It has been more than 45 years since the late Jimmy Carter gave that crisis of confidence speech, the finger wag to the American people to try and tighten their belts and do it a little bit less to grind through troublesome times. And I said this earlier, and I have said this in prior episodes. That is a conversation that the outgoing president, Joe Biden, could have had. It's the kind of conversation he didn't have, and we know it's not the kind of conversation that the incoming president, Donald John Trump, will have either. Remember, when the economy tanked under Trump's watch in the throes of the pandemic, Trump's solution wasn't belt tightening. Trump's solution was get them some money. That's right. Get them some money, taxpayer dollars, national debt, deficit. Get them some money to salvage the economy because, oh, and by the way, put my smudgy signature on it so that I get the credit, so that I can be hailed as a hero. It's no different than what is happening right now, by the way, with coordination from ByteDance, the owners of TikTok, the Chinese company that Donald Trump initially targeted and wanted their app banned. And I don't know if you saw, but when TikTok was down, they left the note. A law banning TikTok has been enacted in the U.S. Unfortunately, that means you can't use TikTok for now. We are fortunate that President Trump, this is ByteDance telling us, that we are fortunate that President Trump has indicated that he will work with us on a solution to reinstate TikTok once he takes office. Please stay tuned. The government didn't take down TikTok. TikTok preemptively took itself down and hailed President-elect Trump as the hero they awaited, even though they took the app down themselves. And then, when it came back, told us this. Thanks for your patience and support. As a result of President Trump's efforts, who wasn't even in office, who sought to take the app down initially in the first place, TikTok is back in the U.S. We already live in an age of distraction, and we're about to enter 4 years of a lot more distraction. Hopefully you're paying attention, and hopefully I'm able to as well. That is going to do it for today's Ron Show. Show notes, as always, at ronshowatl.com. I want to thank Sylvia Broom from Remerge for joining us. To remember Cornelius Taylor. Back tomorrow, 9 a.m., 5 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. Progressive Voices. Take care.